turn in our Bibles, first of all, to Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1. And that's in the New Testament, right, guys? Just making sure, just making sure. Galatians chapter 1. And we're going to read from verses, from verse 15. Well, just two verses in Galatians 1. And now remember, we're trying to look at the character, the person Paul. What type of man was he? Who was he? What made him tick? What made him move and think? And so stop the reading there. Now I want you to turn in your Bibles to Philippians. Philippians, just two books later, or two letters later, chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3, and there again, we will read from verse 4 to 7. Philippians 3, verse 4 to 7. Okay. Again, there, that gives us some biographical material. It gives us some information about Paul's, the person of Paul and who he was. He's gone again. All right, so before we get into a detailed study, I just want to read just a few. I have a book at home that has many of these quotes, and I've just picked a few quotes about what other people say about Paul, the Apostle Paul. A guy called Robert Raymond, who wrote quite a big book about Paul and his journeys and so on, says, Paul is the greatest pioneer missionary the church has ever known. That's my commendation. Raymond quotes somebody else, I forgot, I didn't put the name down, I'm sorry. The Apostle Paul is the most influential Christian who ever lived. Now think about that for a moment. Would you challenge that thought? He's the most influential Christian who ever lived. Think about, wow, that's saying a huge amount. I mean, we've got some pretty heavyweights floating around. We've got their books like Augustine and Calvin and the Wesleys and Whitfields and all these people, all these big shots, and Spurgeon, and lately we've had Billy Graham. Paul is the most influential Christian we ever lived. Think about that. Keep that in mind as we go through the study. A Dutch theologian, a guy called Corinth.The Apostle, he said, the genius of the greatest constructive mind ever at work on the data of Christianity. They put Paul up there as an absolute genius in working through the details of Christianity. And we're going to talk more about that in a bit. Here's another quote. Old theologian, very old. He wrote, the Apostle Paul was one of the most hated persons in the ancient world. He was one of the most hated persons in the Roman world. Somebody else said, Paul was a man Christ possessed, a man intoxicated with Christ, absolutely intoxicated with Christ, possessed by Christ. Okay, so those are just some of the quotes of what scholars and people far more clever than me said about Paul, that he was an absolute genius, the greatest pioneer missionary ever. He was the most hated man. What's that for a contrast, you know? Greatest missionary, but the most hated man. And then, of course, he was a Christ-possessed, a man intoxicated with Christ. So, with those thoughts in mind, keep them in the background of your thinking as we go through. If you go back in your Bibles to Galatians, Galatians 1. In Galatians 1, as we begin to read that, what is the first thing? Have you got Galatians 1? Let me read for me before we look at keep your Bibles open in Galatians 1. Just read some of the questions that I put in the study 2. Study 2. Just read some of the questions aloud for me so that I can just remind. I want to answer those questions or ask you to answer the questions.
Where was Paul from?
Okay, so do you know where Paul was from? You did the Bible study yesterday, so.
No, I didn't. We didn't actually do the study as such. We just kind of gave an overall thing and tried to.
All right, so Paul was from Tarsus, okay? Anybody know where Tarsus is? In Turkey, what today is called Turkey, around the corner. I was going to bring a PowerPoint that I used in the past, but I lost the PowerPoint to show you where Tarsus is that Paul came from.
You should have it in your
So Tarsus was also situated close to a mountain pass. I don't know, we all know what a mountain pass is. The Sicilian mountains come down from out of Turkey, what today is modern day Turkey. And there was a pass that went through that is called the Sicilian Gate. So it's the route that the Romans, well, the Greeks before them, throughout the world, in every continent, everywhere you go, people would find certain routes by which they would travel, trade routes. We know about the Silk Route that comes from China, and there's various routes like that, natural routes, natural passes over or through mountains. People would find them and the roads would lead to them and people would go through those passes. It's the easiest route to the other side, etc. Now, Tarsus was exactly one of those things. This route, this way that they came all the way from Greece through Turkey, would come to the Sicilian Gate, there's a mountain pass, they would come through the thing, and on the other side, on the Israel side of the mountain, would be Tarsus, the city. It was a very important city. From a military point of view, it was critical for the Romans because whoever controlled the city controlled the pass. Whoever controlled the pass controlled the movement of people. And if there was an army attacking force, they could. It was very strategic from a military point of view. Also, obviously, for trade. A lot of people on the same route. It's a lot safer. There's a lot of people, especially in those days when you didn't have an Audi R8 to travel along and zip along through the roads and run away from any bad guys, but that you had to walk or ride on the back of a camel or a donkey or a cart or whatever. So it was slow going. So people became easy targets for criminals and bandits, groups of bandits. So the more people that traveled and stuck to the main routes, they were safe. So this is where Paul was from. Now in verse 15 of Galatians, what do you learn about Paul in that verse? Besides the fact that he was where he was from, we know that. What's the next question, Sonia?
What family did Paul have?
Okay, let's talk a little bit about his family. What do you learn about his family there in these two passages we read? You'll have to have a finger in Galatians and Philippians. You'll have to sort of have a marker in both places. What type of family?
Yeah, the Hebrew family.
A Hebrew family, so they were Jewish. Okay. What else do we know about the family?
And his sister that he used to stay with in Jerusalem.
Yeah, okay. Somebody else? Any others? Any other information we have about Paul? Your mother and father. Well done. What do we know about his father? Wasn't he Greek? No. He was Jewish. He was a Jew. but he was a Pharisee. Because in one of the references we will get to later tonight, I hope, he says, I am a Pharisee of the Pharisee. So that means his father was a Pharisee. But what does that tell us about his family? Sorry? Well, they were unbelievers. The family was, and we'll get to that later. But what else do we learn? Somebody that's a Pharisee. What is a Pharisee? What do you know about people that are called Pharisees? Very religious. Self-righteous? Yeah, of course, nowadays we've got to extend it. But it's a bit of a bad rap for the Pharisees, because Pharisees were very well educated, very religious, very sticklers for the law, the Old Testament law. They were very conservative, so Paul had this family that was very conservative, although they lived in the city called Tarsus, that was a Roman capital of that province. But prior to the Romans taking Tarsus, the Greeks got there first. Remember, the first had Alexander the Great. He conquered all that part of the world and established the Greek culture and Greek worship all over that part of the world. Then the Greek Empire fell and Alexander died, and then a couple of years later the Romans came along. So Tarsus had a very strong Greek culture. In the midst of this Greek culture, and Tarsus, by the way, also had a university. It was known as a university town. It was almost like we would today say Stellenbosch. Most people, if you talk about Stellenbosch, well, one of two things come to mind immediately. They're very good rapping that. I mean, sorry. Either wine or university. Most people would relate Stellenbosch. Oh, did you go to Stellenbosch? No? So it was a cultural center. It was an educated center. It was, people went there to be educated. So in this city, with a Greek culture in it, controlled by the Romans, very strictly controlled by Roman law, all this education going on, you had this very conservative family living there. And that's where Paul was. Okay. So now that already must tell you something of what it was like for Paul to grow up. Although we don't know how much time he spent, we know he spent significant time in Tarsus because his family lived there. But he did have a sister in Jerusalem. And we'll see later on, as we look at some references, how he spent a significant time in Jerusalem as well. So, what else do we know about Paul? Answer some of the questions. Give me more of those questions, or the answer you've got. As we look at them.
Where did Paul study?
Yeah, where did he study? Sorry?
Tarsus.
Well, he learned a lot in Tarsus, but that's not where he studied. I don't. What position did he play? No. He studied in Jerusalem. And I want to take you to some, here we go. Sorry, I'm picking up the ref. My notes are not in the order of the questions. So if you ask a question, I have to find the answer here. But go to Acts chapter 21, verse 40. Let's see. Okay. So there again, what do you learn about Paul? He grew up in a Greek city, a Roman city. But what language did he speak? Aramaic. So again, that tells you, well, can you imagine? Your family's from Congo, right? So you speak French. Because that's your own language. Oh, no, you don't. Okay, I know that we'll ask you that on Sunday. I'm not trying to embarrass you, but you see how conservative Paul's family was. Although they lived in another city, they still spoke the language of their homeland. Now, just stop there and give you some other information about Paul and his family in Tarsus. And the fact that, how he said earlier, that Paul was a Roman citizen. So you got Roman citizenship. Okay? Now, the fact that he was born a Roman citizen meant his parents were Roman citizens. Now, the question is asked, we don't know the answer. The Bible does not give us the answer to this question, but the question is always asked when people study Paul and they talk along these lines. The question always is, how did Paul's parents become Roman citizens? Because if he was born a Roman citizen, means his parents must have been Roman citizens. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been a Roman citizen. He would have received it and he would have had to buy it. His parents had it. How come his parents had it? Now, this is where we come back to the whole issue of his tent-making career. The area that Tarsus is in that area, apparently, never been there myself personally, I've seen this, but I read the books, okay? In that area, there is a certain type of sheep that has long black wool. I didn't write the name down, but I did read the name of this type of sheep. Now, that wool was very good because it's a very cold part of the wool. Those sheep, that wool was very good against for waterproofing and heat. So in that area, that wool was used to make cloth. And from the cloth, it became very popular for the military to make tents from those cloth, from that type of cloth. Paul's family was tent makers. So scholars, when they talk about this, they say, well, that means his parents must have done some great service or had paid the Romans to receive citizenship. And probably as tent makers, they provided the military with tents. And therefore, they were a very influential family and they had citizenship. And he has born to them a son, Paul, and he receives Roman citizenship. Again, what else do we, from that, what else do you surmise of Paul? What else do you learn about Paul? He was Jewish, spoke Aramaic. You think he spoke Greek? Yes. Yes, he spoke Greek. He wrote all his letters in Greek, so although grammatically, the scholars that know, they say grammatically the Greek that Paul writes, grammatically it's all over the place. He breaks a lot of grammatical rules. Don't ask me to show you. My Greek is not good enough. I know a little Greek. You've got a cafe up the road, so that's how I Greek. Okay. What else do you learn about Paul? What else do you, as you hear these things about his family and his parents, what else do you learn about him? He's from a wealthy family. Business-minded family. He's a conservative Jew. He was trained well, and he comes from this wealthy family. Okay? So, in Galatians, back to Galatians chapter 1, verse 15, Paul starts, as he has become a Christian, he's now writing, and by the way, make a mental note of this. This is actually very important as well. The book of Galatians, or the letter of Galatians that Paul wrote, this was his very, very first letter that Paul wrote. I don't know why, well, I know why they put it in where it is in the Bible, but the letters that you write from Romans to Corinthians and so on, that's not in the order that Paul wrote. Galatians was actually his very first letter that he wrote, and he wrote it when he was busy planting the church in Corinth. During that 18 months that he spent in Corinth planting the church, and we'll see more about that as we go, he wrote the letter of Galatians. because he had been to the church in Galatia, and while he was in Corinth, he heard bad news from them, and he writes to confront them. And he writes quite harshly. He says, I write to you to say to you, what's come over you? Why have you left the way so quickly? You know, if you read, he's very, very quickly onto them and confronting them. But this is his very first letter. So when he writes this, he begins by talking about the providence of God. See there what he, I've got open Galatians 1, so I can't give you the exact words, but verse 15. Before I was born, God laid hold of me. What does it say there? Somebody read it to me? Okay. Just go back to the beginning, read that again, read it slowly. Okay. See what he's saying? From his birth, when he pleased God. Now, you must understand the working of God, the providence of God. Now, God, even Paul here looks back, and he has a great teaching. He was born a Jew into a Jewish family, as we see in Philippians chapter 3. We read there that he was a Benjamite. Okay, he was from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews. What is he saying there? It's like me saying, I'm an Afrikaner, but I'm ex-Aboer. I'm an ex-Afrikaner. Okay? My oupa het gebaklei in die Boereoorlog. My forefathers fought in Blood River. My forefather, Afrikaner. Okay? Proud of it. So when he says, I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews, that's like really saying, we're solid. We're pure blood Hebrew people. He takes great pride in the tribe he comes from. That's what he was born into. And he became a Pharisee. And he looks back and he sees the hand of God busy preparing him for a later purpose. So God, you know, and we must recognize that he has a great lesson for us to learn from this whole study we're doing. And in the whole study, and especially on this point, our lives, it's not something that unfolds week to week or month to month, whatever happens, whatever decisions we make. God has a purpose for us. And he's going to work out his purpose. And he's going to prepare us for that purpose. Like he did with Paul. Paul born into this family in the Hebrew of Hebrews, Benjamite, conservative Pharisee, speaks Aramaic. Yeah, he speaks Greek and his home language, Hebrew. And he's really conservative. But he looks back here when he writes Galatians, he looks back and he sees, God, in my mother's womb, it pleased God in my mother's womb. Whatever we do, we must always recognize, even bad things that happen to us, there's a purpose to it. There's a reason to it. So, God uses what we may see as bad things in the past. When we become Christians, God is preparing us. We see that in Paul's life. Okay? So, from Paul's very early days, the hand of God is on him. Now, Paul's birth, until he appears in Jerusalem as a prosecutor or a persecutor of Christians, there's not a huge amount of information of those early years of Paul. But here's what we know. Turn with me into the book of Acts chapter 23. Acts chapter 23. How are we doing in time? I move along, otherwise we're not going to get done. Acts chapter 23 and verse 6. I've got the right reference here. No, this is the wrong one. Okay, here he says, my brothers, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. See, there it is. Clearly saying, I'm the son of a Pharisee. In other words, I'm a son of a highly trained, educated man who lives in Tarsus. I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. And when he said this, it created an argument. Now, who can tell me why did an argument break out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees? What about the resurrection?
The Pharisees believed in the resurrection and the Sadducees didn't.
Yeah, the Sadducees didn't believe there would be a resurrection. And the Pharisees did. And so when the Sadducees came to Jesus and asked him a trick question, there's a brother that marries there's a man that marries a woman, and the man dies. Now, according to custom, she must marry the brother. So she marries the brother, but the brother dies. This happens 7 times. At the end of the day, the Sadducees says to Jesus, when the woman gets to heaven, who will she get married to? What does Jesus say? You misunderstand the scriptures. You don't believe in the resurrection. He nails them on that very point. So what are you asking me here? You misunderstand the law. You misunderstand the Bible. You don't even believe in the resurrection. Why are you asking this question? So he catches them out there. But that's why when we read here, there's a dispute broke out between them. It was over the resurrection. Now, we don't know the birth date of Paul. We don't know what year he was born. All we know is that when Stephen was stoned, he was a young man. And that would have been in the year 34 AD. Now, a young man in different cultures, a young man is, I'm often amazed when I look at the ANC's leader of the youth league. He looks like a very old man to me, not like a youth league. So a young man can be different things. But in the Jewish culture, a young man would have been somebody who would have been past 12, 13 years old. Otherwise he wouldn't be still considered a child if he's not had his bar mitzvah. That's a new Jewish concept. So after the age of 12, 13, they had a bar mitzvah. Then they're considered a man and responsible. And then that would probably be up to the age of about 25 or so when he gets married. But being a young man, being trained as a Pharisee, probably around about 25 years old. More or less, we will guess. We don't really know. So just hang on to that. We don't know. He died, according to tradition, he died in the year 67 AD. In other words, he would have been a man of somewhere in his 60s. Late 50s, early 60s, by the time he died. Good topic. Like how we. Yeah. All right. During Paul's time, he lived through 5 different seasons. Almost like us. We've had how many presidents? Bella, Mbeki, Mukanki, Zuma, now Ramaphosa. We've had 5 presidents. We're probably going to have more by the time we die. So Paul also, there were 5 different Roman Caesars in his lifetime. During his, that's an interesting thing. The city of London in England was formed when Paul was about 40, 45 years old. So when Paul was a young boy, a young man, growing up, the city of London did not exist. It was formed by the Romans when he was in his midlife, something about 40, 45. That puts him into a context so we understand what's happening around him. The Romans are in charge of the world. They rule with the bloodline, with the military. It's called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome that they enforce by. I don't know how much of a peace it is when you enforce it with the military people, but that's what they did. And they built good roads, developed commerce so people could travel. Now, all these things and the background of Paul being a Greek-speaking, conservative Jewish man, zealous. We read in a number of passages that Paul was zealous for the Hebrew religion. He was, as a Jewish man, he was zealous. He would fight. I mean, he voted against the Christians. He persecuted them. He killed Christians. Okay? He persecuted the church to death. You can read at the end of the book of Acts in one of his testimonies. He speaks there about the fact that he persecuted the church to death. He was zealous. I mean, more zealous than that, you can't really get. When somebody goes and gets permission. Now, Paul was also, he was a very highly educated person, but he was also very clever. He was very intelligent. Because it tells us in one of the passages we read, we would have read in either Galatians or Philippians, I forget which one it is, where he says, I was advanced, it was in Galatians, I advanced as a Pharisee above others of my age. So he was the bright boy. He was the guy that was passing all his tests and advancing while the other guys were lagging behind. They were struggling, but Paul was zealous. He studied hard, he worked hard at his being a Pharisee and studying, and he was advancing. And the leadership, he was part of the Sanhedrin. That's the people that control the Jewish religion. The leadership saw this young man, and they were impressed. So when he asked for permission to go to Damascus and persecute or prosecute these Christians and throw them in jail and try and destroy this, they said to him, go, boy, go. You've got our permission. Go, do your thing. And he went up there and, well, it was going to cause a big trouble, but you know the story. Changed for him. Okay? So these are all the things that we learn about Paul. His Greek background. By now, I hope that you've got some sort of idea of his Greek background. In Tarsus, he was exposed to a lot of Greek culture. It was a university city, so there was a lot of philosophers there. And being Paul in his mind, he was a clever guy, he was interested in stuff. He would go to the market, he mixed with people, he was exposed to the Greek culture, he knew it, he was a Roman citizen. All these things, with the Romans controlling the world, for him to travel was actually quite easy. With his Roman citizenship, he could go anywhere. And if we was challenged, what are you doing here? I'm a Roman citizen, I'm allowed to travel. If anybody wanted to stop him or take him to court, he could say, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't do that. He could even, if he was arrested in one of the articles I read this past week, if he was arrested for some crime and he was found guilty, he could say, I'm a Roman citizen, you're not allowed to flog me. And then as a Roman citizen, they weren't allowed to flog him. Or, as happened with Paul, remember when he was arrested in Jerusalem and he was taken down to Caesarea and he stayed there for about 2 years, and they wanted to set him free. They said, no, I don't accept your findings. I appeal to Caesar. As a Roman citizen, he could appeal to a different court. And appealing to Caesar, for Caesar personally to hear his case. Now, all those privileges came to him as a Roman citizen. So as he traveled, he was the perfect man to travel around the ancient world. He had the right credentials, he had the cultures, he understood the Greek culture, he understood the Roman culture, he understood the Hebrew culture, and he could travel. Now, what made it more significant in those years, it's estimated there were about 8 million Jews across the Roman Empire at that time. I can't remember exactly the breakdown about where all these Jewish people were. Apparently there was about 1 million in Egypt, there was about 2 million in Palestine in that area. And there were in the Greek provinces, there were probably in all the trade centers along these routes and in Greece, in places like Caesarea and Thessaloniki and Berea and Athens, Iconium and Corinth, there were Jews doing business. They were part of what is called the diaspora. And the diaspora were the Jewish people that, there are two, you need to understand two things about the diaspora people. One, there were some people, Jewish people, that were taken, if you go back in Israel's history, about 500 years. The Babylonians and the Syrians came and took them to Babylon. Eventually, many of them returned, but not all of them returned. And because of that disaster upon the Israelite nation, many people stayed in Babylon. But during that time as well, many people escaped and went to places like Damascus and Tarsus and wherever. So the Jewish people were dispersed across the ancient world. That's before the Greeks and before the Romans came along, but they were there present. Some of them came back to Jerusalem. When there was peace after the last prophet, there's about 400 years where Israel never had a prophet. During those 400 years, Alexander the Great came with his history, with conquering the world. After Alexander bringing in the Greek language and culture, then the Romans came and brought peace across the whole part of the world. So many Jews saw that as an opportunity to travel and do business elsewhere, which they did. Paul's family was part of that. But as Paul traveled as a Roman citizen, knowing all these languages, understanding all these three different cultures, what did he do? The first thing he did, he went to visit all these Jewish groups in the cities. So his strategy became very clear. And we'll see that as we study. You'll see that as we study. When he went to a new town, the first thing he did, he found the Jewish community. And he went along to the synagogue and preached Christ until they kicked him out. But by the time they kicked him out, there was a group that was already believing in him. So you go to another place in Corinth, we went to the school next door to the synagogue, and he preached to the Gentiles, and many of them got saved. So he started the church very early on, started mixing with Jewish Christians and stuff. So that's the world that Paul lived in. So as a Greek, and as a Roman citizen, and as a Hebrew man, he had the freedom to travel and speak, and he could interact with people and understand the culture. So when he gets to Athens, Sonia and I have been to Athens. In fact, I've got a very nice little video. Athens, where Paul went, he went to the Acropolis, there we go. But just on the side, thanks, mate. Just on the side, there was a place there. There used to be a meeting place there, and the spot is marked where Paul would have sat and debated with people. You may remember the thing when Paul debated there, and he said to them, I perceive you're very religious people. You've got gods to everybody. I see here somewhere you've got a God to the unknown God. And he preaches Christ. He says, let me tell you about this unknown God. And he preaches Christ. Now, the funny video I have, the very steps that Paul would have walked up and down still exist. And I made a video of these steps, me walking down. And as I got to the bottom, I slipped and fell on my If you go to my YouTube channel, you'll see the video. So that was my experience in Athens. But Paul could go and he could speak to them because he understood their culture. He could speak their language. And they realized this is no ordinary fellow. This was an extraordinary guy. He understood our culture. He could quote from their philosophy. And in fact, there's some passages like Philippians chapter 2. Part of Philippians chapter 2 is actually a very old hymn that Paul took and adapted to use in Christianity. So he understood the culture. He had this zeal, he had this passion. First as a Jew, then later, once he was saved, that passion, that drive, that conviction made him greatest missionary we've seen, because he went places and did amazing things. But for me, you know what the greatest thing for me, or one of the greatest things for me is about Paul? Not his passion in mission, his passion for Christ. Yes, his passion for Christ, yeah, absolutely. But there's another thing. You know, one of the things that makes Paul so amazing, as Pharisee, he would have been trained, and he was trained, by the way, you didn't answer the question. Where was he trained? In Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the greatest, at that time, he was the greatest and the best Hebrew teacher of his time. And Paul was trained by him. As part of that training, from a young child, he would have been expected to memorize the Old Testament. And he would have probably have been able to quote most of the Old Testament. As a Pharisee, his training in theology of the Old Testament, that's what they did. They spent 7 to 9 years studying the Old Testament intensely, memorizing it, understanding who God is, learning. Yes, they became hypocrites and they didn't really live it out. But Paul lived it out. But here's the thing. When he became a Christian, I really believe, when you read his story, remember he went to Damascus, God converted him there on the road to Damascus, with appearing to him in a sharp light and saying, "This is, what are you doing, Paul?" And he says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And the whole experience turned his life around. He then spent 3 years in Damascus and in Arabia. We saw that in Galatians, the passage we read in Galatians. He spent 3 years in that area, preaching and teaching. And I believe those 3 years he spent time thinking through, and the years subsequently, all my training of the Old Testament, how do I interpret that in the light of the fulfillment of the Messiah coming? And in his missionary journeys, as he was confronted with problems, he would think it through, and he would write how the Old Testament is fulfilled in the Messiah, and what do we learn about it? That's what his letters really is. Addressing issues on his work, in the ministry, while he's busy, and relating it to the Old Testament. So much of what Paul teaches, you can find the source of it in the Old Testament. In fact, not much, everything he teaches. But the Old Testament interpreted now, not as a conservative Hebrew, Pharisee, but now the Old Testament interpreted through the glasses of a converted Christian, that suddenly sees Christ, God, the Messiah. There, I met him on the Damascus Road. He spoke to me. Changed his life. Dramatic. Now, I wish all of our conversions were that dramatic. Maybe not to the light of God speaking to us, but once we get to know Christ, be that passionate, that zealous for him. But that's the man Paul. That's the person we're talking about. That's the guy that I copied a quote here. See if I could find it quickly. Yeah, here it is. Here's this man, all this knowledge, this genius, this very clever, very intelligent man, highly trained, highly educated, from a very wealthy, very influential family. And by the way, in Philippians, in the passage we read in Philippians chapter 3, where he said, "I count it all as rubbish." Scholars agree what happened was his family disinherited him. He was cast aside because he betrayed the Jewish religion. But here it is. He was willing to sacrifice everything. In fact, Philippians show us very clearly that he sacrificed so much that he was disinherited, rejected by his family, and he suffered the consequence. I want you to turn in your Bibles as we close. I know our time's gone. 1 Corinthians 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8. Now, let me say, I picked this one because we're going to be looking at it in a couple of weeks' time, but there are quite a few other passages like this. I want you to see if you can go and find it. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 8. Now listen carefully to this. When we talk about a man that had all the privileges, all the advantages that any young person could ever wish for, wealthy family, influential family, great education, incredible opportunities, the leaders of the country, of his nation, the religious leaders see his potential, gives it all up. Listen to this. This is what the consequences, this is what is suffering. Already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. You have become kings, and that without us. How I wish that you really had become kings so that we might be kings with you. For it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession. Now, I can talk about that. There's a very interesting illustration he uses there. Like men condemned to die in the arena, we have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as men. We are fools for Christ, but you are so wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are honored, we are dishonored. To this very hour, we go hungry and thirsty. We are in rags, we are brutally treated, we are homeless, we work hard with our hands as a tent maker would. When we are cursed, we are blessed. When we are persecuted, we are endured. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. Up to this moment, we have become the scum of the earth, the refuge of the world. Those are some of the things that he endured, was prepared to suffer as a consequence to preach Christ to go into the world. And yet, in this list, there are other lists. There are 3 lists where Paul talks about his suffering. He's not even talking about the time that he was beaten, he was flogged. He could have said, I'm a Roman citizen, you're not allowed to do this. And they would have stopped, and he did it. For the sake of his witness, for the sake of being a Christian and being able to preach the gospel. He was jailed illegally, the Philippian jailer, when they jailed him, when there came an earthquake. And when the Philippian jailer realized he'd been imprisoned illegally, a Roman citizen, he wanted to kill himself. Paul stopped him. He was stoned and left for dead outside the city. All those things, he was shipwrecked in his zeal to preach Christ. He was prepared to suffer. In our world we live in, to what extent are we prepared to suffer? But Paul, as a person, is a person that should challenge us incredibly in our faith. People love to talk about Paul. He's so great and such nice teaching. But hang on, stop the lorry. Those teachings came at an incredible price. Not the same price. Well, ultimately he did die. But remember, Christ died and suffered. And if those of you who have been in church here and have heard my sermons from Genesis, John chapter 6, 7, 8, 9, we see the conflict Jesus had to endure. Constant attacks on his character, his family, on who he was as a man. Ultimately, his confrontation with the Pharisees and the Jewish people led to him being killed. Paul carries on that tradition.